Welcome everybody to Critical Antiquities workshop for the first one for 2023. Again, I have to take my hat off to the extraordinary work that my colleague Tristan Bradshaw has put in organising the schedule for this year. He's done the lion's share of the work, and it's an amazing lineup we have this semester. And it's my great pleasure to kick off with the first workshop, which will be given by Valentina Moro, who is Assinista de Researcher at the Department of Human Sciences at the University of Verona. It's with great pleasure that we are able to host her here in the workshop, all the way from Chicago, where she's currently located. Valentina is, as I said, at the University of Verona. Valentina did her doctorate at the University of Padova in 2018 on female voices in Sophoclean tragedy, a field in an area in which she's published extensively already. She's been responsible for co-editing an important co-edited collection called Polis, Eros, Parasia, contemporary ethical and political readings in Greek tragedy. And it's fantastic to hear that she has monographs forthcoming in Italian. Il Teatro della Polis, the Theatre of the Polis, Filosofia dell'Agonismo Tragico, the philosophy of tragic agonism, which we also eagerly await its translation into English too, which is fantastic. So we're very privileged here to have a little foretaste of that, of the contents of that monograph, in a paper which is entitled "Staging the Agone, Sophocles and the Theatricality of Politics." Thank you very much, Valentina.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ben, for the kind presentation, and thank you, Tristan, too, for organizing the event. It's amazing that we've met some years ago in person at the conference, and then you started this great project that was meant to connect people with similar interests and also a similar grasp of how the antiquities can be read critically. And I think it's a great opportunity, and it has been a great opportunity during COVID to be in touch. So I'll just try to start from the concept behind the very idea of tragic agonism, by saying that, first of all, agonism is certainly a very meaningful notion in contemporary political theory. I don't need to make explicit reference to Bonnie Honig, to Chantal Mouffe, to William Connolly, now to Dimitris Vardoulakis, who's writing a book on agonism. So that there's a lot that is ongoing on the topic. However, I adopt a slightly different account of agonism in order to interpret the ancient Greek tragedy, which I think belongs in a historically contextualized political vocabulary that I think enables me to properly narrate the polis, or at least that was my attempt by finding my concept, my own account of agonism. I define agonistic as the essentially political connotation of the Greek theater, which depends both on the institutional organization of the ritual festivities and performances, and on the aesthetics of the performances as it is expressed by the poet in the text. So based on those details, those elements that allow us to understand how the poet wanted the performance to happen aesthetically. The concept of agonism is strictly linked to the agon logon, a specifically ritualized form of discourse in the dramas that allows the poet to present two antithetical arguments in the form of two opposed speeches. Therefore, and that's a very important aspect, the structure of the agon-logon is remarkably symmetrical. And I'll get back to this in a few moments. Having in mind Friedrich Nietzsche's famous interpretation of the agonistic spirit of the Greeks, I have adopted a broader and more nuanced notion of agon than the fixed ones with which the ancient Greek term is normally translated. Nevertheless, the term has its own semantic history that is worth briefly retracing. In Homer and Hesiod, it designated both the assembly in which a competition took place and the competition itself. Could be a sport or a theatrical context. Afterward, the same term was used to identify both the specific discursive exchange recurring as a ritual structure in tragic language and the judiciary debates in the courts during a trial. In the dramas, the agon-logon is a space of discussion, negotiation, or conflict, where issues that cannot be addressed in one seamless way are problematized through the exchange and the confrontation between two main voices. In this way, the interpretation of each character's argument and positionality is not dialectic, which means that it cannot be ultimately solved in a comprehensive understanding. Instead, it depends strictly on the relationality between the voices, which expresses a sort of tension toward the polis and competition for excelling among the citizens. If we consider ancient philosophical and political thought in the second half of the 5th and then in the 4th century before Christ, there was a crucial debate concerning the relation between language and reality. And the rhetorical competition, which was defined precisely the agon, played a pivotal role. On the one hand, the Socratic dialectic method fostered an investigation around the nature of things, thus condemning rhetorical ambiguities and contradictions. On the other hand, the sophist rhetorical technique, the heuristic, aimed at securing victory over an opponent in a debate and adopted linguistic ambiguities as the lens through which to identify multiple perspectives and interpretations. The heuristic technique established itself as a fundamental rhetorical strategy, the ritual form of which was comparable to a trial, featuring the two opponents' main speeches and the possible responses. Such a technique was also used to build the arguments in philosophical texts, in historiography, and especially at the theater, both tragic and comic. The rhetoric competition was therefore pervasive in all forms of public speech in the polis, and that very important remark that allows to understand the rest of the work, I would say. Nietzsche grasped two fundamental aspects of Greek agonism that indicate a similarity between, on the one hand, the sport competition and the heroic duel between warriors in Homer's epic. And on the other hand, the rhetorical confrontation in 5th century judiciary courts, the political assemblies, and of course, the theater. The first element is that the goal of the competition was to excel and distinguish oneself from the others. The second is the idea that the conflict, translated into a public agon, assumed the connotation of a scene and was therefore mediated by means of its spectacularity, which is another notion I'm gonna go back to. In Nietzsche's reading, the agon has a fully aristocratic nature, to the point that the philosopher leads us to understand the ideas of exemplarity and value as themselves having an agonistic connotation in the polis. So that's an ethical connotation too. If a citizen proved their value in a competition, this was a matter of prestige, not just for them, but for the entire political community. And this, for Nietzsche, of course, differentiates the context, the ancient context, as opposed to the modern one. And this is also a crucial topic that will come back in my reading of Antigone. So now, why Sophocles? Why this focus on Sophocles? First of all, I have to say that my interest is not just in the formal structure of the agon logon, but rather in the entire agonistic construction of the scenes and the arguments in Sophocles' tragedies, as it emerged in the poet's style, in his language, in his aesthetics. The agon functions as a ritualization of conflict in many discursive productions, rhetoric, literary, judiciary, and political. I chose to delve into the archive of Sophocles' texts, as I believe that among the three main tragic poets, his work better exemplifies the construction of scenes in which the agonistic tension is maintained until the end, and is never solved by merely overcoming the argument of one of the opponents. Even when one of the characters is authoritatively silenced by the opponent or by the chorus, the tension of the exchange persists, and the various perspectives and claims staged by the poet do not get invalidated. However, an issue needs to be clarified right now, because right after highlighting that the agon logon is structurally symmetrical, I claim that tragic agonism, which in the dramas is codified precisely in the agon logon format, expresses the radical asymmetry of the voices on stage, irreducible to any geometry of conflict. It is not a contradiction, precisely because I study the agon not as a technique of dialogue that alternates voices, but rather as what I call the agonistic aesthetics that characterizes Sophocles' theater in a unique way. By preserving the tension on stage and keeping the double or the collective of the voices, the poet reperforms certain features of the daily public debate in the polis institutions. And he does so through his own rhetorical techniques and stylistic solutions. For instance, he multiplies the viewpoints. He disintegrates the individual perspective of each speaker by having the characters question each other, or adding additional information that complicate the general understanding of a scene. He even silences some of the characters while exposing the very operation of silencing. It is even more clear with the female characters how their speeches and actions interrogate the positionality from which each of them speaks within the oikos and the polis, and the network of relationships in which they are embedded, and they themselves contribute to building or dismantling. So I ask myself, in which hierarchies, reciprocities, even alliances and conspiracies are these female characters involved? Which agonistic exchanges do they initiate or foster? How does the audience and the female audience, and we could open a big window conversation here, but let's just assume for a moment that we can solve the ongoing debate and state that there was a female audience. So what was their reception? What was their competence? How did the audience in general and the female audience understand and interpret that relationality and positionality? A crucial example, in my opinion, is the character of Iole in Women of Trachis, who is, I'm not gonna recall the whole plot, so please take my word for that, but Iole is entirely and exclusively constructed in someone else's speech. She is the other woman in the Deianira story, a foreign princess brought to Trachis as a concubine by Heracles, Deianira's husband. Iole refuses to speak as an act of protest and desperation. But Deianaira does not need to hear from her that Heracles has brought another woman to the Oikos. She puts that together even before forcing Heracles' herald Lycus to confess. Deianaira is the one who describes Iole to us as a sort of her double, younger and a foreigner, but clearly a princess, and even more clearly a woman to whom Heracles can be attracted. We get to know Iole only through these similarities and differences from Deianaira, and through Lyca's explanation of her choice not to speak. Therefore, with her character, Sophocles reaches almost a paradox. First, in staging the Logos' ambiguous power to build relationships and deceptions. And second, in constructing the female through a polyphony of voices. And this is another aspect that in the book I try to investigate in detail, the idea of the construction of the female through a polyphony of voices rather than just one character, one claim. And we will see that in the case of Antigone. The woman portrayed in the play does not even have a voice anymore, or at least her voice is silenced after being appropriated by the various interpretations of her character and claim. Does this allow us to say that Iole does not speak because Sophocles does not allow her to speak, thus actively reproducing on stage the same exclusion of women from public spaces that we presume according to many receptions of the Greek sources? Then what is the advantage point in adopting the tragic theater as a source for investigating how the female voice is constructed in antiquity? To answer these questions, we should not consider what Iole cannot do, but rather the way in which her character is constructed, so what she chooses not to do. From a dramaturgical standpoint, indeed, Iole's silent presence on stage, her own body, is so alienating that it ends up being extremely powerful in pointing out the ambiguity of public speech itself in the polis, due to the limitations that silenced many groups of people who were not male citizens. Speaking in public always entails performing an identity or several identities, according to the parameters of gender, family membership, ethnicity, census, which are, in Michel Foucault's words, discursively constructed in their relationality and modes of belonging. Through the character of Iole, Sophocles manages to stage the contradictions and ambiguities of identity and belonging in the polis, with a specific reference to the way women were denied access to public speech. Ultimately, the agonistic confrontation of the voices in each scene reproduces a characteristic of tragic language itself. Not merely a formal aspect, but rather a structural element, because in each scene of the Agon, in which the coexistence of multiple individual perspectives and the tension between them mirrors the rhetorical debate in the assembly or the judiciary courts. So agonism is something more than the contrast between opposed discourses. It is a competition to excel, in which the speaker must prove to be consistent with their own argument and responsible for their own claim. Again, we will see that in the agonistic exchange between Antigone and Ismene. To address the relation between logos, truth, pistis, and responsibility, I dedicate the chapter of the book to Gorgias. It might seem strange to think the idea of aletheia, truth, by referring to the sophist, as it is well known that the Western philosophical tradition has largely excluded the sophists from its canon, precisely because of their radical critique of a concept of truth that is fixed and immutable, elaborated by the Eleatic school. Conversely, I consider the reference to Gorgias essential to thinking about the notion of truth that is political in as much as it is theatrical. This understanding requires the philosophers to think the relational and embodied dimension of what is considered and told as true, and the contingent context in which it is enunciated, enacted, or interpreted. Such truth exists and is understandable only when staged on agonistic theatrical scenes, which is the fully human, the fully human and not divine scene of a choice, a judgment, an assumption of responsibility. Although this concept of truth has been banished from most of the history of the Western political tradition, from Aristotle onward, we can say, it was remarkably present in every public space of the polis, both spoken in its communities as assemblies and spectacularized on stage. And here the concept of spectacularity comes back. I have time for just one example of my analysis of Sophocles based on tragic agonism as a framework. And then I thought that sisterhood in the Antiquity might be the most representative one, probably. Just one brief methodological remark. I treated Sophocles as an author by closely reading his texts without assuming any specific conceptual framework as preliminary, but rather looking for a historical contextualized philosophical vocabulary. I nonetheless chose as well to engage with part of Sophocles' monumental reception, and particularly with gender and feminist studies. So that will come out at some point too. Jane. So since the beginning of the 20th century, the meaning of kinship in Sophocles' Theban plays has raised a great deal of interest in the critical interpretation in the fields of philosophy, political theory, and psychoanalysis. From the 1970s onward, Antigone in particular has become a staple in feminist theory, both as philosophical and political gesture contra Hegel and Lacan, but also in connection with post-structuralism. Conversely, the topic of kinship in Athenian drama has attracted comparatively little attention from classical philologists. And as a consequence, theorists have often been inclined to discuss the theme with reference to modern conceptual framework, rather than to Sophocles' language itself. Judith Butler has recently remarked that in ancient Greek drama, kinship is precisely the site where political conflicts and contradictions explode or are emphasized. Sorry. On the one hand, Butler argues kinship ties are constitutive relationships deeply rooted within a political community and dependent on an authoritative narration, an instance of validation. On the other hand, kinship is a practice, a kind of doing, Butler writes, insofar as it entails various relations of dependency that the language expresses and even produces, and which requires recognition and validation. Several other theorists have studied the intersection between kinship and gender in Attic tragedy. I'm so sorry. It's the moment. Can you take a 2 minutes break if you don't mind?
No problem. Poor Valentina is recovering from a cold, so she's absolutely excused for having to take a break. I wish I had some background music to put on or something, but I don't have anything prepared. Maybe that's something we should have.
I managed to avoid COVID for 3 years.
Oh, so it's COVID you're recovering from as well. Ben, you got a couple of jokes you could tell us in the meantime?
Well, all I can do is sympathise with the experience of COVID, which almost killed me, I must say.
I'm
I
so
mean,
sorry.
I'm
to hear that.
exaggerating. No, I'm exaggerating, but
No,
I felt really, I felt really bad. But yeah.
No, but it just, the sore throat not going away.
course.
Okay, should be there. So, several other theorists have studied the intersection between kinship and gender in Attic tragedy by examining, using different methodologies, the way in which these ideas function as markers in the characters' speeches, making the relationships between the interlocutors intelligible for the audience. Several structures, for example, formulaic expression and lexical elements that recur in both lamentations and in the agones. I'm so sorry.
No problem. Take another minute if you want. It's fine. I'll take this opportunity to refer the audience to the handout which I put in because I didn't draw attention to it earlier. So you can also follow along some of the passages that Valentina is looking at. Take your time, Valentina. You're fine.
There we go. Sorry.
No worries.
So, as Tristan was saying, in the handout, you can find the first passage is the first agonistic exchange between the two sisters that I will refer to in a short time. So, several structures, for example, formulaic expressions and lexical elements that recur in both lamentations and in the agones have a gendered association, such as reference to institutional roles and ritual practices. Now, a close reading to the language of both the Antigone and the Electra evidences that in Sophocles, sisterhood is never assumed by the speakers as a given and solid bond. Rather, the two pairs of sisters invoke, negotiate, and even repudiate it at different moments. Hannah Roismas has emphasized Sophocles' antithetical style, remarking that Antigone and Ismene are constantly in dispute in the play, and arguing that this should be understood as a reflection of 5th century sophistic rhetoric, 5th century before Christ, sophistic rhetoric. Mark Griffith has highlighted that an immediate contrast exists between the two sisters from the beginning of the play. From a similar perspective, Sotera Fornaro has argued that one of Sophocles' innovations is the mise-en-scène of a crisis of sisterhood. Bonnie Honig holds a similar view about the radical difference between the two sisters' arguments and attitudes. Nonetheless, she has interpreted the dramatization of the conflict between them in terms of a secret cooperation aimed at formulating a strong critique against Creon. According to Honig's original reading, the two sisters have rehearsed and are staging together a theater of sisterhood in front of Creon and the citizens of Thebes. I engage with Honig's account of agonistic sisterhood with a similar interest in reading the dramatization of the sister-sister relationship in the language of the play in terms of reciprocity and challenge. I argue that instead of just behaving like sisters, Antigone and Ismene become sisters, renovating their bond as a new partisan relationship between two female subjects who share the same responsibility toward their kin and toward the city. As equal and partners, they aim to narrate a different story from the one Prion is telling in order to secure his power. A story which links the memory of Polynices to the blame of the civil war. I will demonstrate it by examining the second agonistic exchange between the sisters, which is lines 536, 560, and you find it in the handout. I just want to say that, as I was saying, I'm not interested in retracing the agon-logon per se. So what I define an agonistic exchange, it doesn't necessarily have to be an agon-logon. And this exchange looks more like, from a structural perspective, more like a stichometia than a proper agon-logon. But I also have to say that, as opposed to Euripides, whose agon-logon as a structure is usually more precisely introduced and separated by the rest of the text, in Sophocles we have a more nuanced and shifting structure. But then that doesn't mean that it's not a properly agonistic exchange, at least according to my definition. So this second agonistic exchange has been less commented on and examined than the first, although it provides the reader with an entirely different image of Isbini's agency. When the two sisters see each other on stage for the second time, Antigone has tried to perform the funerary rituals by herself, and Creon's guards, after catching her in the act, have arrested her. Finding herself in front of Creon and the citizens of Thebes, Antigone has avowed her deed with a famous sentence: "I declare I did it, and I do not deny it." Line 443. She has claimed full responsibility for the violation of the king's edict, and she knows she will be sentenced to death. By claiming that responsibility, she puts herself in the position of confronting the king directly. Now that she acts alone, Antigone seems to have no more fear of openly challenging the king. So my reading is that at the beginning of the play, she had wanted to keep her plan to bury Polynices' corpse secret and to act covertly, not just to protect herself, but also to protect Ismene, whose collaboration she was asking for. All of a sudden, Ismene appears on stage and interrupts her sister's strategy, right after the agon between Antigone and Creon. At this point, the king has just condemned Antigone to be buried alive with the family members to whom she claims her love is devoted. He insists on Antigone's concept of philia, which contrasts entirely with the only one he declared one must fight for, the love for the political community one belongs to. And as he states, and this is line 182, 183, if any man thinks a friend more important than his fatherland, that man, I say, is of no account. Notably, Creon remarks that Antigone is a woman, Guinea, stating that as long as he is alive, the paradoxical situation in which a woman can rule will not happen. This is on line 525. When Ismene enters, crying and lamenting for her family's fate, Creon, enraged, accuses her of having cooperated with Antigone. He immediately assumes that he has two enemies instead of one, and that their goal is not just to bury their brother's corpse, but to rise in revolt against his reign. And that's the beginning of the passage that I quoted in the handout. You who were lurking like a viper in my own house and secretly gulping up my life's blood, while I was oblivious that I was nurturing two plagues, two revolutions against my throne. So Creon accuses the two sisters of revolting against Kapanastasis. Here, Sophocles uses a military lexicon in order to mark a sharp contrast in the king's speech, as if the civil war were still ongoing. For Creon, whoever sides with Polynices is a political enemy for the entire community of Thebes. While Antigone has insisted on her bond with her dead brother, Ismene strongly invokes her sisterhood with Antigone, and now depicts it as defined by cooperation, just as Antigone had in the first agon between the two of them, which is line 199, the prologue of the poem, of the play. Interrogated by the king, Ismene pronounces a formal avowal, declaring that she is Antigone's partner in crime. I did it, Dedraca, if she consents to this version. Therefore, I share the guilt, Sumetisco, and I claim responsibility for the deed, Therotes Aetias. This is line 536, 537. So this sentence can be read in two ways. On the one hand, Ismene autonomously claims responsibility for the burial. On the other hand, paradoxically, she asks her sister to confirm that she did it, as a form of permission to share, Sumetisco, the punishment with Antigone. Apparently, Ismene aims to strengthen their bond so that Antigone will trust her again. But Antigone denies her this. No, justice will not permit you to do this, since you were not willing to help with the deed, nor did I give you a part to it. But Ismene's declaration has still the effect of a proper avowal, inasmuch as she becomes immediately guilty in the king's eyes. Ismene does not describe the bond with her sister as an alliance against Creon, as he claims it is, nor does she use military terminology to describe it, as Antigone herself does in the first agon. Although her sororal bond with Antigone is rooted in their shared blood, Ismene knows that in order to establish it as a mutual cooperation, she needs to show Antigone full support. So at line 544, 545, she says, "Let me die with you and make due consecration to the dead." She claims that she shares the responsibility for something that both of them have accomplished. But at the same time, she is individually responsible before the law, Therotes Aetias. The verb submetisco, which means participating in something together, sum meteko, designates an active collaboration, and in this case, it entails an autonomous decision. Ismene's language also expresses the same idea by using the dual form. And indeed, at line 558, she says, "The transgression is the same for both of us, non." Antigone herself had used the dual form, but in the first agonistic exchange while she was asking her sister for her help. So while Antigone keeps denying any possible contribution of Ismene, the letter persists. And this is a very important couple of lines, 540, 541. "But now, with the sea of troubles around you, I am not ashamed to sail in a sea of sufferings with you." So the way in which the term sum plum, sailing together, is used as a metaphor by Ismene entails their mutual responsibilities on which she keeps insisting. The term sumpleo is very interesting because it is fairly rare and it is mostly used in the military lexicon or in technical language related to navigation. But it immediately evokes the political metaphor of the ship of state, which shows its resilience while sailing in troubled waters. which we know is a widespread topos in ancient Greek literature. In fact, in the Antigone, the nautical metaphor recurs elsewhere, but always in a man's speech. For instance, Hammond uses it, Tiresias, and most importantly, Creon does. In his Rhesis, pronounces to the chorus when he appears on stage for the first time. And this is the second passage that I quoted in the handout, which is line 162 to 10. Creon in this passage opens by saying, "My fellow citizens, first the god, tossing the fate of our city on wild waves, have once more righted it." Several critical commentaries remark on the connection between Creon's speech and Pericles' funeral oration, as reported by Thucydides in the second book, which emerges clearly when Creon refers to the necessary primacy of the interests of the city over the interests of the family. Creon insists on his own concept of philia, the one to the polis. And he does it several times in the speech, 182, 187, 190. He says that he has made such concept public with an edict. He legiferates over this concept with an edict that he defines a nomos, a law. But such an account of philia is framed in a divisive way. It's not universal. When he claims that if the citizens obey his decision, they will prove that the polis is their first concern in life. The first image Creon evokes in his Rhesis is precisely that of a huge storm, or lo salo, sent by the gods, which endangered the community and which is now over, that is, the civil war. Afterwards, he claims that one who is in charge of a political community has to demonstrate how valuable he is by means of the laws he promulgates. That's line 177. He insists that if a sovereign does not make his best efforts in steering the ship of state, Eutunium Polin, then he is the worst man ever, 178 to 181. Ultimately, the nautical imagery reappears at line 189, 190, when Creon stresses that the city saves, esodzusa, those who navigate it well, pleontes or thes. Since sailing was undoubtedly and exclusively a masculine activity, it is surprising to find this term used by Ismini as a metaphor. My interpretation is that although Ismini does not adopt the same metaphorical meaning as Creon, her metaphor has its own political relevance, which can be grasped precisely by comparing it with Creon's speech. This nautical imagery usually depicts one subject, either the helmsman or the ship itself as a collective subject, completely alone, facing adverse conditions and avoiding sinking. In this case, Ismini presents herself as Antigone's companion in such a risky navigation. Sophocles remodels this imagery, which in this case is tailored on a double figure. The two sisters as two sailors, or even as co-helmsmen or helmswomen. Let's look at the bigger picture. At this point in the play, both Antigone and Creon have described the attempted burial as a unique and extremely serious act of disobedience. Antigone seems ready to die in a glorious way, like many tragic heroes. When she tells her sister, and that's 559, 560, "Take heart, you live, but my life has long been in death's hands, so that I might serve the dead." Creon knows that Antigone's violation of his edict can be truly dangerous only if it makes it inoperative, by inspiring other acts of resistance and disobedience. Therefore, although his edicts it states that the people who transgress it have to be stoned in public, according to Antigone's version of it, the king decides that his niece will be buried alive. By avoiding executing her in public, he seems to be willing to keep her act of open challenge under silence. For this reason, I argue, Ismene repeats her sister's avowal, publicly declaring that she is responsible for the same deed. She claims she has replicated something as unrepeatable as an open challenge to the king. If one compares this scene with a trial in which Creon, in the role of the prosecutor, interrogates the two sisters, it clearly emerges that it does not matter whether Ismene actually helped Antigone with the burial or not. It does seem plausible to Creon. Nonetheless, Ismene asks for Antigone's permission, if she agrees, because she wants her sister to confirm her version and to corroborate it. And when she does it, she addresses Antigone with the affected term casignete, sister, line 544. The same word she used at the beginning of the play in the attempt to persuade her sister not to break the law. Antigone adamantly refuses to give her consent and even denounces Ismene for lying. A friend in wars is not the type of friend I love, line 543. So while saying that, she distinguishes the words from the actual deed. And she adds, do not share my death, that's line 546, stating that their sororal tie has dissolved. But why does Antigone refuse Ismene's help? What if at this point in the play, their bond has been secretly renovated and reshaped as an alliance with a political goal, which is Bonnie Honig question indeed. Antigone knows that after her death, Creon will publicly interpret her deed as a crime, motivated only by her desire of revenge, including her among the enemies of the city, just as he did with Polynices. Moreover, he will not allow anyone to mourn her. However, if Ismene keeps narrating the story of their family, thus preventing Creon from denigrating Polynices' memory, Antigone's act of rebellion will resonate in the city after her death. This would explain why when Ismene asks her, tell me how can I help you, even now, line 552, Antigone simply replies, save yourself. According to this interpretation, in the second exchange between the sisters, Ismene has understood that her sister's plan is a self-sacrifice. But with her unexpected avowal, she seems to reject this solution by pleading guilty herself. Ismene might have understood that Antigone's act of rebellion cannot be effective as long as Creon can undermine her claim as the isolated provocation of a criminal. She claims that she is her sister's partner in crime, thus provoking Antigone, who categorically denies it. So each sister's speech is a response to the other one's unexpected move. Creon insists on the fact that he is the only one who can establish how the political community has to behave in order to avoid the political crisis and the civil war, and that the citizens of Thebes have no choice but to obey him, even if his decision forces some of them to repudiate their family members. In a political context in which aristocratic families held great power in the city, after a civil war initiated by the previous king's two heirs, Creon demands from the citizens of Thebes a clear demonstration that they would sacrifice even their kinship ties for the sake of the polis. Therefore, the two sisters stage a political critique of Creon's decision, and in so doing, they enact a model of behavior based on cooperation that differs entirely from the king's authoritative discourse. Indeed, the two sisters make the divisiveness of Creon's edict evident and offer a new perspective on collaboration by showing how it is possible to navigate together over troubled waters. The interpretation of sisterhood presented in this paper frames the reading of the two sisters' speeches and behaviors in agonistic terms, by means of a new paradigm of acting together. I have interpreted this paradigm in the light of the metaphorical figuration evoked by Ismini of the two sisters sailing together. And I have provided my own reading of this image as opposed to Creon's political metaphor of the ship of state, thus retracing two contrasting political messages. On the one hand, a double or collective female figure characterized by movement. On the other, a static, isolated male helmsman who struggles to preserve his own alleged right to establish who are the friends and who are the enemies of the sea. Thank you. And I'm sorry for this slowness.
Thanks so much, Valentina, for a lovely presentation, and no trouble at all for your coughs. So we have time for question and answer with the audience now. So as Bob Cowan has helpfully demonstrated, we usually proceed by putting the letter Q in the chat, just so we can keep track of the order of questions. You're also welcome to type a question, which I can read out if you would prefer that. But since the questions are coming in thick and fast, how about I'll just jump to Bob Cowan.
Thanks, Tristan, and many thanks, Valentina. That was really wonderful. I just wondered, you very convincingly justified your focus on Sophocles, mainly contrasting with Euripides. I wondered about Aeschylus and early tragedy in general in this context, where we have fewer agons. We rarely have two actors interacting with each other at all. And so, I mean, obviously things like the septem, even to some extent the suppliant women, the Persae, there's largely an actor and the chorus, sometimes engaging, sometimes not. Of course, when we do get an agon in Aeschylus, it's in Eumenides between an actor and the chorus. So I just wondered, I mean, two related questions. One is there a different dynamic when the chorus is one of the agonistic competitors, and is this something which is, as you were implying, fundamental to the nature of tragedy aesthetically and institutionally, or is it something which emerges perhaps in the 460s and the 450s, perhaps a political shift, perhaps a Sophoclean innovation, perhaps a response to the rise of the sophists that you mentioned? So 20 different questions there. Feel free to answer any.
Can I ask, can I answer immediately, or do
yeah, go, please.
Happy. Thank you so much for this question, which is great, because that was what I asked myself at the beginning. So, because I started by looking for these contests in the plays in which there were two defined characters contrasting each other. But then I realized how important is the role played by the chorus, even in that kind of contrast. So I'll start answering the end of your questions, which is, for instance, the fact that one of my agonistic examples is Antigone's lamentation at the end of the play, in which she, I claim, agonistically engages with the chorus itself, that is actively pushing her. And my reading is that the chorus responses push her to formulate her argument better. So, for instance, she compares herself to Niobe, the goddess, and they are like, why are you comparing yourself to a goddess? So it's an active dialogue, and my reading is that we cannot just assume the chorus is consoling her, not that they're contrasting her. And that particular approach led me to wonder, is there a difference when we have female choruses? For instance, how does the female chorus treat Electra or the Anaira? And I found these lexical elements in the plays. For instance, at some point, the Anaira asks the chorus to cry with her. She says, let's cry together. And it's amazing because Antigone cannot do that with an all-male chorus of elderly. And there are some similarities in Electra too, because she engages with the chorus that at some point calls her daughter. And so all these details mark a significant difference, but also let us say that the chorus can actively engage as an agonistic partner. As for Aeschylus, that's a great question. And I think that the collective female voices in Aeschylus are an element that needs to be explored a lot. For instance, the suppliants, but also, of course, the Eumenides, and the context in which these voices play a role is very significant because, for instance, the suppliant speak to a king. So there is all of this. The reason why I initially chose to focus on Sophocles is most of all for his biography, because I wonder how significant he has been in the whole history of Athens, how central was his role over the 90s here he was alive. But then I realized that the agonistic construction of his work speaks to us in such a rich way that, yeah, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't focus on the other poets, of course. So thank you for the question.
Ben.
Well, it's nice that you mentioned the biography of Sophocles. I mean, of course, we don't want to reduce the meanings of tragedy to the biographical details of the lives of tragedians. But I think in this particular case, it's an interesting one because Sophocles was a strategos in the suppression of the revolt of Samos. And one could argue that the Antigone is full of this language of alliance, right? Sumachia. And the predominance of compound words in Antigone with sun is extraordinary. And as you pointed out rightly, there's a lot of neologisms there, sumplun, sumphilane, sunechthane, all these words like that. And of course, that contrasts very much with the equal prominence in that play of autos compounds, right? Autonomia and autonomos and you know, doing things by one's own hand and all of that. And so the exchange between Ismene and Antigone, I think, is usefully read against the backdrop of the way in which the long alliance between Athens and Samos. Samos was a founding ally of the Athenian Sumachia in 477. And so her revolt is not just inconvenient or disruptive, but is a stab in the back, right, by somebody who is understood to be a sumphilia, right, a philos. Later on in 404, Athens will give Samos isopoliteia, right, equal status with Athens in terms of citizenship. Athens' relationship with Samos then is kind of represented as about as close as an ethnic relationship can come to being a familial one, a kinship. And so the betrayal of Samos in 441, at which Sophocles himself was a commander, would have been very interesting because it would have been really, really noticeable that when the Athenians sailed against Samos, Samos was not sailing with them, but against them, right? So there's no sumplun with Samos, which had been traditional. And so this whole idea of Ismene coming to Antigone later on and saying, look, I want to share in the victory after, but I don't want to actually have participated in the toils of victory, right? Is I think a really, really interesting one. This idea that Antigone is articulating is that, you know, you either go through the suffering and therefore you win our autonomy, or you just become a dependent, in which case you don't deserve any honor from me whatsoever. And I think that's a metaphor from the polis that has been extended to the whole of the Athenian alliance, particularly since it's made clear later during the Peloponnesian War that the Athenians are starting to think of their alliance as a suprapolis, sort of a metapolis, right, where the allies are kind of like equal partners in joint ventures, and all that language of joint ventures and so forth in the Antigone is really interesting. So it's not so much a question, but just a kind of something to add, you know, weight to your excellent observations.
This is extremely helpful. Thank you so much, Ben. I've been asking myself a lot about how Sophocles' bibliography can enter in the interpretation. There has been written extensively on Alcibiades and how Sophocles was for sure struck by the way in which this extraordinary man was excluded and then brought back in the polis, and how this figure played a role to understanding alliances and loyalty as being military values, but also civic values. And I think it's really important. But what you are saying is even more, because the role played by Sophocles that we just assume, the role played by Sophocles in the history of the polis that we just normally assume to be critical toward the more demagogic Democrats, is actually an active role in the military life of the polis. And for instance, in the Philoctetes, I think it emerges very clearly how this problem of being loyal to the army and be excluded from the army and being isolated and then brought back for the sake of the city can be extremely problematic. But then I was asking precisely, what does it mean when we find the military lexicon, the military vocabulary in a woman's speech? How can Antigone talk alliances and so on and so forth? So thank you so much, because this was extremely helpful for me.
Demetrius.
Hello, Valentina, and I should say, you know, you're a bit like a Homeric hero. You know, being able to do a presentation while having COVID, that's incredible. I just wanted, like, I mean, I don't have a question kind of about what you presented, but a question about the sort of scope of your argument, and you know, I think you kind of underplay the importance of what you're presenting here, because the implications of what you're presenting are, I think, much wider than simply a sort of very close reading of Antigone. And I think there are two aspects of it. One is you basically propose a method, a different method of reading tragedy, right? Reading Greek tragedy, reading Greek tragedy around the agon logon, you know, and that's, you know, from a hermeneutic perspective, that's really significant. But a second and even more important aspect that I want to hear your thoughts about, and like I'll be very interested to see how you deal with that sort of problematic, is the fact that there's been this kind of huge literature, very common in the discourse of agonistic democracy in the last 30 years, but going back at least since back to Nietzsche at least, namely that the tragic has something to do about our ontological condition or something like that. I think the expression that and then you link it to the agon logon, the tragic you link to the agon logon. So my question then is, like, does this notion of the agon logon that you present here influence and change the sort of meaning of that tragic being that kind of determines us, that we get at least since Nietzsche, if not later? I mean, you see someone like Bonnie Honig or William Connolly, for that matter, to mention a couple of people that you talked about. For them, life is tragic, and that's why we need agonism. But your reframing of tragedy kind of inflects this in very interesting ways.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad that you're here today, and I'm very glad for this question. So yeah, my aim was really wondering, first of all, which kind of source the theater is, because it's a unique kind of source within the Greek context and as compared to any other theatrical source, because it stages a scene always, and it cannot be separated by the context in which it was represented. And I think that Nietzsche, in his essay Homer's Context, gets that and expresses that in an amazing way. Like the agonistic spirit of the Greeks is what the tragedy expresses, and that's true. This means that the ancient Greek theater is different from any other theaters in any other epochs, so in any other period. So assuming that, I was trying to understand how the theater communicated to the audience. So what did it mean to stage a content, and how did the audience and the city reflect upon themselves? And we can use the reference of Nicole Leroux, for instance, just to mention one of the most important names of people who insisted on that, expressed that, like how the theater was a way for the city to politically engage with itself and to be staged and to build the very community. So I'd say that that's the kind of meaning that we can attribute to what you just said, the ontological condition of the tragic. Because in the 5th century, with the sophists, we get that it was impossible to just assume that the truth was the truth. It was impossible to assume an ethical system of values as being given by the gods. So everything was questioned and was internal to the dimension of the logos, to the circulation of the logos, to the relational dimension that is fully human. Given that, the tragic condition, I would say, is precisely the awareness that was the world in which they were living. And on stage, what was happening was precisely showing that that very engaged and very context was not only a way to navigate political issues, but also a way to produce an ethical investigation of how to act, how to govern a city, how to be part of a community, and so on and so forth. So I don't know if I actually answered the question, but I think that was what I was trying to deal with, to engage with. So.
I mean, I agree with everything that you say, but you're not really answering the question, because I think what you present is a kind of different way of approaching tragedy in ancient Greece. And given that the notion of the tragic in modernity is founded upon this notion of the tragic in ancient Greece, this has a kind of domino effect on how we understand the tragic in modernity. I understand that you don't want to go there, but I think the implications for your work are kind of much more far-reaching than you want to admit at the moment. That's what I'm saying. I mean that as a compliment, you know.
Thank you so much. No, I will keep thinking about that, but it's definitely working on working in the back of my mind. And I'm considering, for instance, commenting on the comic theater as well, and trying to look for what it does to the understanding of the polis itself, for that theatrical implications that but the Greek citizen was the theatrical citizens, the citizen that went to the theater, that engaged in that kind of assembly just as much as he did or she did somehow in other contexts, in other assemblies, we can say.
So there's a question relating to this in the chat, but just before I get to it, I want to ask a question that is also an extension of Demetrius's, because it's about this question of ontology. So in your use of the term, the agon logon, you know, I see it in the abstract for your talk, and it looks like, though you can correct me, that you're using it in terms of agon and logon, where logon is the nominative adjective to agree with the nominative of agon, right? Is that how you're using agon logon? Uh-oh, now you're muted.
Okay, it's in the plural. So agon, yeah.
Oh, great. So that's perfect.
Yeah, so well, it's the adjective to the name, yeah.
Well, then my question is redundant. That's fine, because I was going to suggest that there should be logon as in with a genitive, you know, plural of.
Yeah.
So that's great. That's
maybe
great.
Copy and pasting the abstract, something got lost. I just wonder what I did, but no, it actually reminds me something that maybe I didn't stress on enough, but. So the structure of the agon logon is, for me, the ritualization of what agonism is for the polis as a moment, as a specific moment of the tragedy. So it's just one example that it's very problematic for me, and it was at the beginning. Then I kind of solve this puzzle, because the agon logon is structurally symmetrical, or at least it presupposes this symmetry between the voices, which is definitely what the agonism in the polis did not presuppose. So very briefly, I can say, how is it possible in the polis that someone like Antigone can symmetrically face the king in a debate? It doesn't happen. That's what the tragedy stages, and this very dynamic of staging, I called it in the book, bringing back into the walls of the city, within the walls of the city, the subjects that the city was excluding, like Philoctetes, Antigone, all of these exceeding subjects were brought back and were even allowed to explain their claims, their reasons in opposition to a king. But it wasn't, of course, a real symmetry. It was how the police translated in and displayed into a scene the conflicts that were actually happening in the city. So thank you for the question, because you allowed me to say that.
Thanks. So we probably have time for one more question, and it has been typed in the chat by Eleanor MacGyver. So I'll just go ahead and read it. I hope that's okay, Eleanor. Do you think the audience could also have functioned as an agonistic partner to the theatre? For example, where a perspective is not explicitly challenged on stage, but is designed to provoke counter-arguments in the audience?
That's an amazing question. And yeah, that's what I try to, well, first of all, to give credit, Bonnie Honig mentions that in the book, and because she says that Antigone is agonistic toward the audience itself and engages with the audience itself. And as written in the question, there were indeed details that exemplified like a back and forth from the public to the audience. So for instance, there were moments, we used to think about that in the comic theater, but it happened also in the tragic theater, that there was like the audience could get involved. But beyond the actual involvement of the expected involvement of the audience in specific moments, there was also an ideal or theoretical involvement of the audience itself, because, for instance, we know that there were aspects of the narration, aspects of the play that the audience knew about, that some of the characters didn't know about. So that's for sure. There were also ways, I can mention again the example of Antigone's lamentation at the end of the play, because she recounts her story, she retells her story through the lamentation, using the space of the lamentation, under her own conditions. And as I was saying earlier, the chorus engages with her and asks her, why are you comparing yourself to a goddess? But she goes on, and that's an active engagement with the chorus for sure, but there's an active engagement with the city itself for sure. And in the book, I provide other examples of characters that engage with the audience in a strange way. Deianira in Women of Trachis does that. And it's weird because she's a female character, and she is not the exceptional character that Antigone or Electra are. So how can she be such a prominent figure on stage, and so on and so forth? So there's a lot that can be said, but yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Are there any final questions? We've got just a couple of minutes if there's anything pressing. In that case, please join me in thanking Valentina again for this, especially under the circumstances of COVID recovery. This was a great presentation and a great contribution to the thinking about critical antiquities. Actually, which just has just reminded me that I was meant to ask the first question and I didn't. So I sorry. So in the final 3 minutes, I'm going to put the question back to Valentina, which I said I was going to ask and then didn't, which is how you see this work contributing to a critical antiquities more broadly.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think that it contributes, or at least I hope it contributes by historically investigating the vocabulary, the philosophical vocabulary that I try to use, and trying to question the readers, or at least those who engage with the antiquity, to question their own archive, or the archive of sources that they use. So for instance, does the secondary literature we engage with reproduce exclusions in the debate? Or does it actively contribute to let us have a critical approach to the sources? So a way to question the methodology, for instance, but also specific contribution is the one that gender and feminist studies in antiquity do to all of the involved fields, specifically because they cannot just assume an object to study. What's gender? What's sex in antiquity? How is the gendered voice constructed? They cannot just assume one answer, one interpretation. They have to be critical and to understand critically what's staged, what's displayed. Otherwise, we can just say, we have just to assume that the female voices, the real female voices were not there in the sources. We do not really find them. But if we investigate how the female is constructed and problematize this construction, maybe we can say a lot more about gender and sex in antiquity, or relationships in antiquity, or politics, for instance. I tried to.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll let you go now.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Valentina. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next month for Mario Tello.
I'll be there.
Ciao,
Okay.
ci vediamo.
Ciao, buona serata.
Bye.